Welcome to the Automotive Diagnostic Podcast. We're going to explore ways to sharpen our diagnostic skills, find learning resources, and hear from experts in the automotive field. Hey, what's going on, automotive world? Welcome to another episode of the Automotive Diagnostic Podcast. My name is Sean Tipping, and I'll be your host once again for today's episode. Today on the show, I'm going to be sharing a case study with you on an interesting Chevy Malibu that I dealt with a couple weeks ago. I don't have all the answers for this one, and that's why it makes it really interesting. I kind of wish I would have had some more time to do some testing on this one, because the more that I thought about it after the fact, the less confident I was in my fix, even though it appears to be, even to the point right now, that the car is fixed. So I'm going to go through this with you because, again, kind of strange symptoms. Took me quite a while just to reach the fix. I guess I'll put that in quotations for now, or at least the thing that we did to get it to stop doing what it was doing. And it left me with some questions for sure. And I kind of wish I still had the vehicle and the bad part, but that's the downside to being mobile and running a business. Sometimes I don't have that option. I got to get rolling to my next one. And who knows, maybe I'll see this one again. We'll let you guys weigh in on that and see what you think as we dive into this one. So here's what we're dealing with. It is a 2014 Chevy Malibu with a 2.5 liter four-cylinder. This engine has variable valve lift and variable valve timing. This vehicle particularly is equipped with auto stop start, right? And that's important for this one. It's part of the symptom that we have, but this is where once you meet all the criteria, you come to a stop, the engine will automatically turn off. And then as soon as you release the brake pedal in progression to acceleration, the engine is going to restart before you even hit the accelerator pedal. That's the idea anyways. That's how the system is supposed to work. And this vehicle is equipped with that. So the shop calls me, and pertaining to the auto start system, so the vehicle has shut down, it's going to restart. On this restart, the customer complaint is that when they go to restart the vehicle after it's stopped, it has an extended crank and sometimes won't even start at all. Sometimes it starts and kind of chugs and then it gets going, but this is very inconvenient if you're sitting at a stoplight and trying to accelerate from a stop. Your engine's just sitting there and cranking and the engine's chugging and it's not going. So that's why they brought the vehicle to this shop, and the shop's pretty good, and they went through it and they were looking at, whatever they could to figure out. There wasn't any codes that they had to go with. They were able to duplicate the symptom, but they weren't able to really come up with any reasons why it was doing this. So they called me in to do a diagnostic on this. I show up and I talk to them. They explain to me, this is a very repeatable pattern. We can get it to do it pretty frequently. The tech even told me you can do it with the scan tool. There's a function within the scan tool to activate the auto stop and the auto start with just the push of a button, which I found is actually pretty useful on this one because it can be kind of picky as to when the auto stop start will activate driving, right? Meeting all those enable criteria when you're trying to do testing is not the easiest thing in the world. So you could do this with the scan tool where you shut it down as an auto stop event and then restart it as an auto start event, and it will act up there. Now, the interesting thing is you do get this extended crank, right? You get this when you do the auto stop start event. But if you cycle the key, like there's a physical blade key that goes into the ignition, if you turn that off and then you start the engine, every single time starts up perfect. No issues, no extended crank, no chugging. It's like there is zero issues. And you can go right from one to another, right? I could have the scan tool connected. I could do my auto stop and then start event. It would extended crank. What it reminded me of was an old GM vehicle with a fuel pressure regulator that was leaking, if you've ever experienced that, where it's dripping fuel into the vacuum line and it just cranks and cranks and then eventually it picks up and then starts going and it chugs a little bit. Really reminded me of that. But it would do that every single time that you would do the auto start event. But if you were to cycle the key, turn the key off, and then crank with the key, boom, starts right out, no issues. And this was very, very consistent, which at least that part of it was nice, is that we were able to duplicate this problem. So anyways, I get to the shop and the tech tells me about this. And so I actually went out to the vehicle to do this. I tried with the scan tool a few times just to see if I could duplicate it. And it did seem like a little bit of an extended crank when it was doing it in the parking lot on my first visit. I scanned the vehicle for codes. I don't see any codes in any modules, and the shop had told me this as well. And they said they didn't even clear anything out. They just didn't have any codes pertaining to anything. Okay. And so before I decide to dive in, because I didn't see anything really stood out as obvious. Again, I don't have any codes to go with. I just want to do a quick bulletin search on this. And I do this on most of the vehicles that I'm working on, just to eliminate the possibility of something that's already been diagnosed by the dealership and they have a bulletin out for a replacement part or maybe a software update, right? And I always want to get that out of the way first, so I'm not wasting a bunch of time, chasing a really weird problem that could be fixed with a software update, right? Because a lot of the times, if you're trying to chase a problem that's fixed with a software update, that's going to be really, really difficult to nail down, right? You're going to get to the point where like, well, I think it's the PCM, but I don't really have any proof. Well, somebody else, the dealership, or the manufacturer has already proved that out by creating a software patch for that module to fix X problem. So I'm just going to do a quick search because this is kind of a strange problem where it's only during the auto start event that it has an extended crank. And, a lot of the time, especially on the vehicles that I work on, they're, between 8 to 12 years old. That's kind of my bread and butter. You don't always find a software update that's going to fix a vehicle. I would say most of the time, the software updates don't fix the vehicles that I'm working on. Occasionally, but most of the time, they've already been done. It's already been through the dealership cycle earlier in its life, and those types of problems have already been resolved. So if there's a problem, something's generally broken. But I did find a service bulletin for this Chevy Malibu that outlined my exact issue, the exact symptoms that the shop was talking about. All right, cool. So it says during an auto start event, when you've stopped and you go to restart, you've lifted your foot off the brake pedal, that it gives you an extended crank. And then sometimes you have to actually cycle the key to start the engine. I was like, well, this is exactly what they were explaining to me. And there's a software update, and the engine control module, this is what you're updating, needs this update. I checked the calibration based off of GM's website and what was in the module, and it needed this update. It was a level behind on the software version. Okay, perfect. This is a slam dunk right here. And so I go in, I talk to the shop owner. I'm like, hey, I've got this TSB, outlines your exact problem. Would you like to do this update to the vehicle? He's like, yeah, let's take care of it. So I kind of switch gears from diagnosis to programming, get out my programming equipment, set up the voltage maintainer. I do the update on the ECM. It takes a little while to go through. Okay. And then after the fact, I tried it a few more times with the scan tool to activate the auto stop start. And it seemed fine to me. It didn't seem out of place to me. And I think I know why. I didn't experience it here, and I'll get to that later, but I didn't really see anything that was a problem here when I was attempting it. And so what I told the shop was like, I did the update. It seems to be fine. Why don't you guys go drive it around and see, and then just let me know if you have any other issues. I got to roll to my next one. All right, cool. So we did that, and they call me back the next day. They say, yeah, it seemed okay at first, and then we drove it, and then it started to act up again. Exact same thing. Really hasn't changed much at all. Okay. All right. And, neither of us feel too bad about this, right? You have a bulletin addressing the issue. Like, that is definitely the first thing that you need to do. You got to get that out of the way before you spend any other time trying to chase down the problem. But now we do. At least we have that out of the way. I'm a little curious that, this exact issue wasn't fixed, even though it outlines it in the service bulletin. Okay. Well, I'll come back and we'll dig back into this. So when I come back, I decided that I actually need to go out and drive this thing now rather than just doing it with a scan tool. I kind of want to experience it as the customer's driving it. Now, I did talk to the technician again, and he's like, yeah, I'm able to get it to act up with the scan tool as well, pretty much every time. But what I noticed here when I got to the vehicle, it had been sitting. Actually, there's another thing that I noticed that I want to mention here. When I first started this thing up this time, when I got to it the second time that I came back, I got the key and the vehicle had been sitting overnight. It hadn't been touched in a while. And so when I first started it up, I heard a rattle from the timing chain area. And I just took note of that. I didn't think a whole lot of it. It went away pretty quickly. But I definitely heard a rattle from the timing chain area. Okay. And of course, I scanned this thing again for codes. There's 0 codes in it, nothing that's pertaining to what I'm dealing with. But I want to go drive it. And so I'm driving this thing, and it was really tricky to get the auto start event to happen. Now, there is a data PID list that you can see all the enable criteria, and you can actually see what is preventing me or the vehicle from doing an auto stop and then an auto start. And you can meet those criteria. But even still, honestly, especially when I'm mobile, I'm kind of on a time frame. I want to get this thing figured out. It was a hassle just to get it to do the auto stop start. And then I have to, pull up the right data stream and hopefully be looking at the right thing and try to observe what's happening during this extended crank. And it was honestly a hassle. Of course, I'm driving the car by myself, and so I want to be safe and not staring at the scan tool. So I found a parking lot, but then, you got to get up to a certain speed before you slow down, before it'll do an auto stop. It was really a hassle. And I did get it to do it at least a couple times, and it did do the extended crank after I'd driven it for a while. At this point, I tried it with the scan tool, and I was able to get it to do the extended crank with the scan tool every time now. And I think the correlation here, actually, I should say the correlation here, is the fact that the engine was warm. And that was the key. This thing had to be hot in order for this to act up. And I verified this later on. If the engine was cold, this thing would actually start up normally. It wouldn't have an issue. It wouldn't have an extended crank. And that's what happened to me the day prior. Is the vehicle, the engine was not hot, especially after I did my programming. It wasn't hot, and it actually did the start normally. So if this thing wasn't hot, it didn't act up. If it was hot, it was consistent all the time. Every single time, scan tool or not, doing it normally, it would act up and give you an extended crank. Again, only on an auto start event. If you cycle the key and you do it with the key, it fires right up, even hot. So really, really strange. But at least now I'm to the point where I can get this thing to happen consistently. So what I want to do now is try to look at data stream items that are going to pertain to what I'm dealing with. And one of the first things I'm thinking about is fuel pressure, right? Something to do. And this is a direct injected vehicle, but I want to look at the fuel pressure in the system to see what's happening to it, if anything, that could be causing this extended crank. So like I mentioned, it really felt like it was like an old school fuel pressure regulator leaking, and it's getting too much fuel on startup. And, maybe there's an injector dripping down or something like that that's causing this to happen. So the downside to doing the scan tool actuation of the auto stop start is that I can only look at one area of data stream, data PIDs. And if you're not familiar with GM, how they do their data PIDs is that they break it down into groups, right? So you'll have a fuel trim, you'll have a misfire, you'll have induction, you'll have electrical theft, you'll have camshaft actuators, right? And so it'll have a group of data that you go into. Once you select data stream, you select one of those areas. That list of data stream PIDs is what you can see in that group. And if you want to go to a different group, you have to exit and go into a separate group to see whatever you want. Now it'd be nice, and I don't know, maybe their factory scan tool allows you to pull from different areas. I know you can do that on Chrysler Y-Tech. But with aftermarket stuff that I'm using, I don't have that option. But when I go into the scan tool and I'm going to do the auto stop start actuation, so this would be, you go into actuation tests, you pick auto stop start. It asks you, do you want to see a data stream or not? I select yes. The only data stream that it allows me to see is the enable criteria for the auto stop start. So realistically, this is not very helpful. This is not going to show me what I need to know, because I'm looking for things like fuel, spark, induction, something that would prevent it from starting, right? The auto stop start enable stuff doesn't really help me in this scenario. So that's the disadvantage to doing the scan tool. Is it's easy, it's repeatable. I can just hit a button, I can get it to do it, but I can't see the data pits that I want to. Now, the downside to going in and driving it is this thing just seemed to be really, really picky, and I got to try to get the right data pit up and graph it as it's happening. So I did try that a few times, and I was really looking at fuel pressure. I'm driving it and didn't see anything that was indicating an issue. I'm looking at some other things like induction, spark, other fuel PIDs. Everything seems fine. And my fuel trims while it's driving seem fine. I couldn't see anything that stood out as an issue. Now, granted, I didn't look at everything, but that's because driving it, like I said, was just time consuming, and I was getting a little bit, frustrated trying to get this thing to act up. So I decided to park it again. And what I was going to do is do it with the scan tool. I can't see the data PIDs that I want, but I decided I'm going to actually pull out the scope here. And I just want to look at some of the basic inputs and outputs to the engine to see if I notice a problem. Okay. And what I mean by that is I want to look at cam, crank, fuel, and spark, right? Very simple. So I'm going to look at the injector pulse to the injectors, and it is direct injected. So I did amperage. I'm going to look at the spark to the engine. And then I'm going to look at cam and crank signals just to see, is there anything funny? Is any one of these dropping out? Is there anything going on? So I scope all this stuff with a Pico, and I'm doing this with the scan tool, and it's doing the extended crank, and I don't see anything that stood out. I think if I would have looked at one of these data PIDs a little closer, maybe I would have noticed it, maybe not. I don't know. Probably not. I definitely didn't notice it in the moment, and nothing really stood out there. So at this point, I got another couple hours into this thing messing around, and a lot of it was driving it around, trying to get the auto start event to happen. And so I had to call it at this point because I got to stay on a schedule. I got a lot of cars to get to. I told him, hey, give me one more shot at this. I'm going to go home, read up on this, come back with, fresh eyes and a fresh mindset. And sometimes that's the best thing to do, right? Especially if you're getting frustrated with something, is to walk away from it and then come back. You can research, you can think about it, you can talk to people, you can get some ideas together. But if nothing else, just walking away from something makes a huge difference. And I found that as a technician all the time too. If even in something mechanical, if I'm getting frustrated with it, I remember a timing belt on it was some sort of Toyota or something. And I just, every single time I put the belt on, one of the cams was a tooth off. Oh no, it was a Subaru. That's what it was. It was one of those dual overhead cam Subarus. And those can be frustrating if you don't have the special tools. But every time I did it, one of the teeth was off, or the cams was off one tooth. And I spent, I don't know how much time and tried it so many times. And I was getting so frustrated with this thing. And finally, I just walked away from it for a half hour. I had some lunch, or I did a different car or whatever. I came back and the belt went right on immediately, first try. And I always found that to be the case, is walking away from something that's frustrating you. When you come back to it with a fresh set of eyes and less frustrated, it just works. It just makes sense. And that's true of diagnostics too. And that's kind of my mindset here, is like, hey, I'm not going to keep beating my head against the wall on this one. I'm going to reset. We'll come back. And he was cool with that. He's like, yeah, we just got to get figured out. So I do that. I do some reading. Didn't really find anything pertaining to this exact issue other than the TSB that I had already performed the update on. And so the next day I knocked out some of the easier jobs, programming and stuff. And then I come back to this, and what my plan is now, because I didn't really find anything. I read up on the system, the GM service information. It doesn't really give you anything that stands out as something that's different that's happening during the auto stop start, right? And that's what I was looking for. It's like, what's different about this during an auto start event that's, not happening when you cycle the key? And again, you can bounce right back between the two and notice no problem with the key, but then there's a problem with the auto start. What is different? Where's the change with the ECM operation? And unfortunately, in the information that I found, I couldn't really find anything. But obviously there is something, and there is something happening that's causing this thing to run poorly. But what I decided I need to try to do is get data PIDs up while I'm getting this to happen with scan tool activation. So here's my thought that I had that I wanted to try is I want to put a OBD2 splitter and connect it to the OBD2 port in the vehicle. So what this is you plug into that port under the dash, and it has two cables coming off of it, so you could plug in two scan tools. And I've used this for a couple things in the past. Sometimes it doesn't work, sometimes it does. But my idea here is I'm going to get one scan tool up, and I'm going to connect that scan tool to actuate the auto stop start event. I'm going to get the other scan tool plugged in the other side of that splitter, and I'm going to pull up the data PID list that I want to see, whatever that might be: fuel, induction, spark, cam timing, stuff like that. So I get this set up, and when I first get to the vehicle, I notice the rattle again on first startup only. And none of the other startups do I notice this rattle, but I noticed it again. And again, I took note of that. I was like, okay, that's consistent. That's 2 times now when this vehicle has been sitting. I have a rattle from the timing chain area. Oh, and I do want to add that I checked the oil level and condition in this engine, and it was just fine. Okay. I also noticed, just like the previous day, this thing would not act up when the engine was cold or when it was not operating temperature. So it took this thing getting up to operating temperature before it would act up. And as soon as it was every single time. So at least I've got some consistency. I've got some pattern here. But I've got my 2 scan tools set up. And so now I'm really ready to go through and comb the data stream. And I can do this in an efficient manner, right? I could do this driving, but it was frustrating and time consuming. Doing it this way, where I'm actuating with one scan tool, reading data PIDs with the other, this is going to be much, much more efficient to comb through all of the data PIDs and see if anything stands out. Now, with the 2 things that I have, that I've noticed so far, a rattling timing chain and the fact that this only happens hot, the first thing that I want to look at now, because it's all kind of connecting in my brain. And like I said, sometimes walking away from something, you see what you didn't see before, or you think about what you didn't think about before. And I just made this connection, like as I'm plugging into this car, I'm like, I need to look at the cam timing here, right? And we've got that rattle. I don't know exactly what's going on. We don't have any timing codes in this thing. There are 0 timing codes. The phasers are working properly according to the PCM. But the fact that it only happens when it's hot, my mind goes to maybe something like the oil viscosity changing what's happening here, right? As the oil gets thinner, this is going to change how this thing's acting. At least that's what I'm thinking, but I need to look at the cam timing and see what's going on here during startup. So what I do is I pull up the cam actuator data PIDs. So this would be for the VVT. There's variable valve timing on both the intake and the exhaust. They have separate phasers, separate solenoids. What I pull up is the cam timing variance. So you can see desired and actual for the cam timing, or you can just look at the variance data PID. And the variance data PID is just the difference between desired and actual. Okay. Engine computer wants the intake cam at 10 degrees. The desired would say 10 degrees. The actual should say 10 degrees. If the actual says 15, the variance would be 5, right? And so I think GM, you want that under 4 degrees. If it's over 4 degrees difference for 3 seconds, it sets a timing code or a VVT code. So that's what I'm going to look at first, is the variance in the camshafts as I'm getting this thing to act up. So again, had to get the engine hot, but I'm hitting, I think I had the top on one side of the splitter. I hit the auto stop. I've got my data PIDs up on the autel, looking at the cam variance for intake exhaust. I hit the auto start. It does the extended crank, and I see that my exhaust cam timing variance is 28 degrees during cranking. And that's while this thing is chugging and trying to start. And then as soon as it starts, it drops back down to 0. Okay. I did this 3-4 times. It's the same thing. Now my intake cam is fine. There's like a couple degrees of variance, not much, but the exhaust cam timing goes 28 degrees out every single time that the extended crank happens. I also tried it with a key. I'm like, okay, let me just see what it does with the key. You do see it jump up to 28 with a key cycle, but it drops back down to 0 very quickly and the engine starts up. But it does move, and the intake does not move. Either way, the intake is very close to 0 on the variance the whole time, but my exhaust goes to 28. And again, it's at 28 degrees while this thing is having an extended crank problem. Okay, so at least now I'm onto something. I see something that doesn't quite make sense. Why are we not setting codes? I'd imagine it has something to do with the enable criteria. Maybe this thing isn't looking at the variance during cranking. Maybe it's a short enough period where it doesn't trip the code. Not 100% there, but either way, I've got something to go on here and I need to figure out what's going on. Of course, like I mentioned, makes sense with the rattling, makes sense with the engine temperature. And now I've got a data PID to confirm this. Okay, so I go under the hood. You got to pull a big plastic cover off of one of these 2.5s to get to the VVT solenoids. I do this. I look at the exhaust VVT, and it is a relatively new Dorman part. Okay, I see the wallet with wings right on the top of this VVT solenoid on here. So, okay, so now another thing that's like kind of cluing me in, I know Dorman's been trying to change their name and everything, but the fact of the matter is they still cause a lot of problems. I mean, a lot of aftermarket parts do, but boy, anytime I see that wallet with wings, I'm considering, is this part any good? Is this going to do its job the way it's supposed to, especially when it comes to engine electrical parts? I'm always very, very suspicious of these. So, and it's relatively new, right? This thing was put in, I would guess, within the last year, just based on, you can see this part, it just hasn't been in there as long as the other parts under the hood. Okay. So what I tried doing first was, I was like, well, let me just unplug this thing and see. And so I unplug this VVT solenoid. I get the same thing. It doesn't really matter. I do set some codes now, of course, but I get the same extended crank with a stop start. I get the normal start with the key. That didn't really make a difference. But I really do feel like I'm onto something with this. And so I go talk to the shop owner. I'm like, hey, this is where I'm at so far. Here's what I've noticed. I've found this, aftermarket VVT solenoid in there. He's like, oh yeah, we put that in there about 6 months ago because they had some VVT circuit codes, right? The circuit codes for the solenoids, pretty common on these engines. And we put that in there. I was like, okay. So like, can we just order a different brand and pop it in there? I'll wait. I'll even put it in there. It's 110 millimeter bolt. I'm right there. I just want to see if this takes care of our issue, because I really feel like I'm onto something here with the data PIDs that I see and the fact that it's a new part and now all of a sudden we have an issue that's happening. So they order up the VVT solenoid and we pop that in there real quick. After I do that, I got my dual scan tool set up again. Our problem is gone. And I made sure to get the engine hot, and I'm looking at the data PIDs. Again, couple degrees of variance, but very, very small and nowhere near the 28 degrees. And I must have tried this about 20 times because, I just want to make sure, okay, this solve our issue. This change what we had going on. I don't see any issues, and there's no extended crank, right? The symptoms that the customer is noticing completely gone. My scan tool looks good. Okay. So I went out and drove it, and I did get it to do it a couple times. The auto stop start event, again, it's fine. Starts right up. You can accelerate normally. Okay, cool. So I talked to the shop. Here's where we're at. This definitely made a difference. I think you guys should let this thing cool down and then go drive it again a few times and verify that there's no issues, scan it for codes, and then you can send it out to the customer. But I think we're good here. And he agrees. And so they do that and they end up sending it to the customer. They're good. And I called him this week, actually. It was about a week later. And I just wanted to follow up with him. I'm like, hey, did you hear anything back on that? What did you guys experience after you drove it? He said it was fine. They gave it to the customer. They haven't heard any issues on the vehicle. All right, sweet. So as far as I can tell to this point, this vehicle is fixed. An aftermarket VVT solenoid causing an extended crank only on an auto start event. Now, here's the thing, and I kind of do this to myself, but I think about this stuff after the fact. And it was, again, one of those scenarios where like I'd spent a lot of time on this and I had to get rolling. Like I had to get moving to the next job because I got a lot to do. I got a lot more shops. This isn't my only shop that I work with. And so I didn't have time to swap out and do a bunch of testing and figure out the exact whys of this. But the more that I thought about it, the less that it made sense. And so I kind of have it in the back of my mind now. I'm like, did I really fix this vehicle? Is this thing going to come back with some other issues? And this is the last part of it that I just kind of want to go over with everybody because I'm actually kind of questioning whether this vehicle is fixed or not, or if there's more going on with it. And, really at this point, all I have is speculation on what's happening, because I will say this, I'm not super familiar with the 2.5 engines. I've had a ton of the 2.4 Ecotechs apart, but I didn't do that much work on the 2.5, so I don't know the internal workings of the VVT and the cam system that well. From what I could read in service information, it seems pretty basic. It's got a solenoid, it's got a locking pin in the phaser that oil pressure releases so the cam can advance or retard. And it uses oil pressure, fed from that VVT solenoid. Seems very, very simple. But let me start with this. Here's what I know about this vehicle for sure. That that exhaust cam was definitely 28 degrees out during cranking, even during a brief time during normal cranking, but that it didn't experience the symptom during normal cranking, only the auto start. The problem was noticeable, hot only, right? So if it was cold, it didn't seem to act up. And there was a rattle on startup, cold from the timing chain area. Now, what I didn't do is I didn't wait for the vehicle to cool down to see if this rattle was gone. And I'd be very curious to know if this rattle was gone or not. Of course, these are all the things I'm thinking of after the fact. But when I first got to it, that rattle was definitely there. And I know that putting a different VVT solenoid in there made a difference on this. It definitely changed the fact that this thing had an extended crank. I also know that there's no timing codes in this thing, even when there was a problem present. So when this thing would act up, there was no codes in this. And the shop told me they never cleared any codes out of this thing. They never had any timing related issues, and I didn't see any either. When running, the variance was 0. Now, the things that I don't know here that are leading me to question myself is why this was only noticeable as a symptom during the auto start event. What is the computer doing differently during an auto start event as compared to a key cycle? Like, what happens differently? What's going on with the spark, with the fuel? I'm really at a loss there because there's nothing outlined in service information or nothing I could see in the scan tool. And it's not even the VVT operation, because I mentioned I unplugged the VVT solenoid and it did the same thing. It didn't make a difference. So it's not the computer's control of the VVT solenoid. As far as I can tell, it still has the same issue. But what else is the computer doing differently during an auto start event that would change this to make an extended crank? Because it was night and day difference if you use the key. So I'm really not sure there. That's an answer I don't have, and maybe one of you does. I'd be very curious to know. I also want to know, how was this phaser unlocking on startup, right? Because there is a pin in the phaser that needs oil pressure to release in order to move the 28 degrees off that it was. So how was this phaser unlocking during startup? And one of my thoughts was, well, maybe it's bleeding past the solenoid, right? Oil pressure is bleeding past the solenoid into the phaser, unlocking it. But if that's the case, wouldn't it bleed past that solenoid at all times? Wouldn't it bleed past the solenoid when it's running, when there's even more oil pressure? And so that kind of falls flat to think about it that way. But that was the only way I thought a solenoid could affect a phaser's by oil pressure bleeding past it, especially when it's unplugged, it's still doing it. That was my only thing, allowing oil pressure into the phaser during cranking because it's bleeding past the solenoid, but it would bleed past it running too, and you would have some variance while the engine was running, and you didn't. And again, going back to the key, why is it different with the key? But that part of it kind of falls flat too. So what this kind of gets me to is that, is there an issue with the timing chain? Is there an issue with the phaser? And I have not correctly identified the problem with this vehicle, even though 100% putting that solenoid in made a difference. I just don't feel 100% confident because it doesn't quite make sense. And it's I maybe shouldn't even do this to myself, but I do. I think about this stuff while I'm driving around in the van. Some of the vehicles, if it doesn't make 100% sense for the fix that I made, then I really start questioning myself. And I've read up what I could on this one. Service info is, it's not that great. They give you a real basic overview of the system and some diagrams, but I'd love to see the inside of one of these things. I'd love to do some more experiments with one of these. Again, wish I could have on this one. And who knows, maybe I'll see this one again, right? That could be the thing, is maybe this comes back. I wouldn't be terribly surprised, but so far, that hasn't happened yet. So anyways, I wanted to share that one with everybody. And heck, if anybody has any experience or knowledge on one of these, I'd love to hear it. I'd love to hear what you have to say. Maybe you know where this is going. Maybe you know the issue, and at least I can be prepared when this thing does come back. But I thought it was very curious what I've experienced on this one so far. So thought I'd share that with you. Hopefully you found that interesting. I appreciate everybody listening. Appreciate all the feedback. With that all out of the way, let's get out there, start fixing the world one car at a time.